My name is David Carlson. I am with the University of Notre Dame Press. Thank you for joining us today for a slightly unusual, but I think quite exciting installment of our Books for Better Understanding series. Normally, we invite an author and a guest on to discuss a book, but today we have two authors discussing two books. We're joined today by Paul Scherz, author of The Ethics of Precision Medicine, Problems of Prevention in Healthcare, and Travis Pickell, author of Burdened Agency, Christian Theology and End-of-Life Ethics, which are both available now from the University of Notre Dame Press. Paul Scherz is the Our Lady of Guadalupe Professor of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame, where he researches the intersection of theology, science, medicine, and technology. He is interested in the role of virtue ethics of the Stoic variety, especially in moral theology, and his scholarly publications touch on topics including human enhancement, genetic technology, end-of-life ethics, the moral formation of scientists, the role of risk in contemporary practical reason, the ethics of artificial intelligence, and, of course, the ethics of precision medicine. So in addition to the ethics of precision medicine, he is also the author of Tomorrow's Troubles, Risk, Anxiety, and Prudence in an Age of Algorithmic Governance, which was published in 2022, Science and Christian Ethics, which was published in 2019, and he is the co-editor, along with Joseph Davis, of The Evening of Life, The Challenges of Aging and Dying Well, which is also available from the University of Notre Dame Press, and it was published in 2020. Travis Pickell is assistant professor and chair of the Theology and Ethics department at George Fox University, where he also serves as the director of the Cornerstone Core Curriculum, the co-director of their program for leadership and formation, and a faculty fellow of the George Fox University's honors program. He is also a research affiliate and advisory board member for their Human Flourishing program at Harvard University's Institute for Qualitative Social Science, and is the co-chair of the Christian Theology and Bioethics Interest Group at the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. His research interests include ethics, theology, religion and medicine, technology, and pluralism in public life. So you can see perhaps why we wanted to bring these two together a little bit. Thank you both so much for joining me today. And I'm actually going to start us off this time with a question for each of you to answer in turn. If you could just sort of talk about like how the book came to be, sort of your inspiration, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to go ahead. I'll start with Travis.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's such a joy to be able to do this and to talk to Paul, who I've known for some time as well, and but to talk about his book, which I very much enjoyed getting a chance to read. So, my book comes from wrestling with some experiences that I had early on in my own doctoral studies at the University of Virginia. I went there to do ethics and theology, and did not have a sort of bioethics interest in mind. But the very first week that I was there, a couple things happened. I was assigned to be a teaching assistant for a large 350 person bioethics class with Jim Childress, which was very interesting, even on its own terms, to be able to start to ask questions that, or to realize that bioethics is about very deep questions, and it's always changing and it's always interesting. And so that kind of opened up my mind on one hand. But then I also was diagnosed with testicular cancer my very first week of my PhD program. So I was in and out of the hospital doing chemotherapy and surgery while also teaching this bioethics class. And so having that experience of both the practical personal experience in the hospital, but also the sort of more academic side at the university, just sort of cracked open the hospital and healthcare as a moral space, and one where deep philosophical and theological questions are constantly being raised, and even for myself, and started asking questions about the assumptions that I was bringing into those experiences and whether they aligned with some of my deeply held core convictions that came out of my own Christian faith, and realized that many of them, the unreflective ones, were not, and that maybe I had to rethink some things. And so it got me thinking about the assumptions that we all bring into those encounters and where they come from and how they're influenced by the society around us, and also how they may be reformed and reshaped through a more intentional engagement with Christian theology and Christian practice. And really that kind of came to the fore thinking about how we struggle to die well in our culture, a lot of the things that drive some of the problems that we all can recognize, but also, don't really know what to do with. Sometimes these things feel like wicked problems that everything you try to change actually makes them worse. And so, trying to think about that sort of at the meta level and the macro level, but also on the personal, individual level, got me thinking about primarily about choices, decisions, and the assumptions that we have that go into those decisions about what it means to have or preserve dignity, what it means to exercise autonomy, um, how our assumptions about our agency being active and in control are ultimately shown to be somehow problematic when it comes to the end of life, because the end of life serves as a symbol of your ultimate lack of control in many ways. And so, that became a big puzzle for me. And so that was kind of at the root of the book, and the central sort of concept, burdened agency, to me came about by seeing that two things were happening at the same time. We have more and more choices about how and when we die that actually are in many ways thrust upon us or upon us on behalf of others. So doctors or proxy decision makers as well, deciding for people in their care. More and more decisions are being placed in our hands, whether we want them or not. At the same time, we have less and less to go on culturally. We don't have very thick or strong cultures around death and dying practices of how to make meaning out of them and what to do in our sort of post-secular, pluralistic society where things are, we might have religious traditions we engage, but they're not necessarily very instructive for us at this time. And so that's the basic problem that I'm trying to wrestle with and give somewhat of a constructive response. So that's how the book came about. And yeah, I'd love to hear from Paul about his own thinking.
Yeah, yeah, great. I mean, yeah, it's a wonderful book. Yeah, and so, yeah, so first, thank you for having me here, and it's wonderful to get the chance to talk with Travis about this book. I mean, it's a great book. But what inspired my book is I started out my career in genetics. So for good 8 years or so, I did genetics research, and what I found over the course of my time in research, but especially once I left genetics and came into moral theology, was that genetics was becoming less and less focused on finding cures and more focused on discovering risks. And so you have 23andMe, the now bankrupt company, was telling people what their different risks of cancers were, Alzheimer's, these kinds of things. And this all came together in a whole new framework of medicine, precision medicine. So I was really interested in the history of how you get this change from what I started out doing in genetics to this like intensive focus on risk. And what does that do to think about risk so deeply? And once I started looking at risk, I started seeing it everywhere. I mean, their financial system is governed by risk. Social media algorithms have a lot to do with risks. Policy is all about risk. And definitely, even in medicine, a lot of the medicine that we do now is about less treating disease, more preventing risks and things like that. Um, so that was the framework for what I wanted to do. It was this major issue that was all around us and is reshaping our medical system. And to me, it signaled that it was connected to two major problems. First, thinking about risk all the time raises the problems of anxiety, right? So you start thinking, oh, you start feeling less that you're kind of a healthy person just going normally in the world, and you start thinking to yourself, well, what about the risk of this? What about the risk of that? So it transforms our subjectivity. Secondly, once you know about a risk, you want to do something about it, right? And so, but anytime you're intervening on risk in medicine, at least, you're having the possibility of side effects from medicines, complications from surgeries, and raising all these other risks. And it's also transforming institutions to try to get other people to control their risk by joining wellness programs or governing doctors' actions through guidelines. So the book is an attempt to explore these problems, explore the dominance of risk and how that arose, and then suggest some solutions towards the end end of the book.
I'll just pick up. I mean, I'd love to hear you just expand, Paul, on two aspects of risk that really struck me reading your book. One is um, how risk became associated with medicine specifically, so the medicalization of risk, and how it came to be that we look to medicine to solve our risk. So where does that come from? What's the sort of story there? But then also outside of that, um, I was just sort of struck by you mentioned start to see risk everywhere once you start to think about it and risk management, and was thinking more broadly and culturally about maybe how you would um, where do you see risk being proliferated as a sort of central lens for our approach and engagement with the world? I mean, I was even thinking about different parenting practices that arise and, how you start to see like different ways of minimizing risk as much as possible in relation to how different people think about where their kids are during the day or X, Y, or Z. So I guess a two-sided question. One is sort of broadly culturally, why are we so caught up in risk? And then also like how does it get medicalized specifically?
Yeah, so why are we broadly caught up in risk? Well, I think it has something to do with there's some fundamental shifts that went up on with practical reason in the modern period. Once you have game theory being developed, once you have a more utilitarian stance in the world, which came in with a lot of the policy frameworks that entered after World War II, risk just becomes a natural way of thinking. I mean, so many people are trained in it, right? A lot of people are trained in management theories. We're trained to gamify our lives and think of our lives in terms of maximizing and things. So I think that becomes a major problem. But we're also more and more responsibility is dumped on us, right? And I think this is where our books really have an overlap in terms of less and less depends on kind of just going along with the kind of cultural traditions, getting the same job that your parents did, but you really are placed in charge of your life, right? And if you fail, then it's your fault for the decisions you make. So you better take care of the risks and make sure that you're avoiding them. How it got medicalized, that's a lot of different things that came in. So there's a couple of different streams. I mean, first there was just research that discovered that some long-term research that discovered that there were risks like smoking, right, came up, right,
Mhm.
and discovered that like there's a lot in our and pollution, and there truly is a lot in our environment and things we do that um, can lead to risk, right? Can lead to bad health outcomes. Secondly, pharmaceuticals companies soon discovered that there's more money to be made in treating risk than to curing disease because
Mhm.
after they discovered antibiotics, everyone was excited, but then they realized like as soon as you cure a person of their infection, then they're not going to buy your antibiotic anymore. But with a risk reducing medication, once they get on it, they're on it forever, right?
Mhm.
And that's a much better market model. And third, health insurance took over. And so insurance companies, I mean, that's what they do. They do risk. So
Mhm.
they started impacting the management of healthcare. And so that's how, in general, medicine turned towards risk. And
Mhm.
what genetics did and new AI technologies, it just gave us much more powers of prediction.
Mhm.
Right? Yeah.
Interesting.
Um, yeah. I mean, one of the questions I had for you, I'd love to, and like building off that kind of questions is concerns over reflexivity, which is, I think, part of burdened agency, right? This is the essence of what you're doing. And one of the questions that I always wrestle with, but I'd love to hear your response to, is a lot of people say like, so what's new? Didn't people think of dangers in the past to me? And so I say, and then you get your canned response, right? But
Mhm.
for you, I mean, burdened agency, I think you're so right, right? That there is so much in our contemporary death and dying practices that it's dumped on the patients, and they feel that they have this weight of responsibility bearing down on them. But I mean, but one of the things that I think about is, and I'd love to hear your response about is, so what is the difference between this kind of burdened agency and highly medicalized dying versus other kinds of tragic choices that have always faced people at death, and Christian death especially, like martyrs and things like
Mhm.
that, and people entering into, yeah, various kinds of situations where they were following medical care or not following medical care,
Mhm.
these kinds of decision. Um, and in terms of the reflexivity that the burdened agency has, how it requires, right? There's a lot of people who might say, well, but isn't reflexivity a good thing? Isn't this need to kind of think about your values and not just depend on I mean, this is the modern autonomous self, right?
Yeah.
Not just depend on the tradition, good for you, right? The unexamined life isn't worth living goes back to the
Mhm.
earliest. And so I'd love to hear like how you respond to those kinds of concerns.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's why I sort of started to think about it in terms not just of reflexivity, but maybe like hyper reflexivity. Like we need a new category because very clearly there's much that we should and ought to be thinking with and wrestling with and being critical about and self-critical about in our daily lives. And we need to have a sense of why we're doing things the way we're doing things and what could be changed and what we maybe should change or shouldn't change. And so all of this is sort of, what the book talks about in terms of like reflexivity, thinking back upon oneself about, considering the why behind the choices and how they go. The problem is we have an amazing ability as a species to consider counterfactuals, we might say, or to consider hypothetical situations. We have an ability to if we were to have no limits to the reflexivity, we would have no end to what we could call into question.
Mhm.
And there is, to me, it's sort of like a tipping point where I don't know where the line is, and it might be different for different people or different societies, but there's a tipping point in which if there's nothing that can be taken for granted, then we will be overwhelmed existentially with the amount of things that we have to figure out. And I think, in some sense, the dream of existentialism is that you sort of embrace that as a challenge and you just go into it and become who you're going to be. But I think it's ultimately an unlivable reality to be like a complete existentialist or to have completely everything up in the air. And so. Um, Clearly the answer isn't uh, to simply bow before authority in some uncritical way. And so I guess the question is like, how do you find the median when more and more things are being placed in the foreground rather than the background? And my view on cultures and institutions and religious traditions is that, I mean, I believe one particular religious tradition is truer than others, but I also have this sort of functionalist view of religion and that it exists in many ways to provide the context for us to have livable lives by answering a lot of the questions that we might be constantly wrestling with. It gives us sort of like an existential sort of cocoon to move out from and to live from. And so, um, I think so to me, going back to your question, what's different? It really is just sort of the scale and speed at which things are becoming placed in the foreground, and specifically the question about um, uh, whether we ought to, in a sense, it's like whether we ought to cause our death, but it's not exactly that. So the book isn't exactly about assisted suicide and euthanasia per se, or withdrawing treatments, the narrow ethical issues, but it's more about like how do we come to that place where we can accept the end when it's coming. And that is, I think, you mentioned the Christian martyrs or people in any age ultimately do have to have this sort of ultimate recognition of the lack of their control. And I think it's more natural for them to, say, for example, the Christian martyrs, early Christian martyrs, um, to at least have certain things that were answered for them. They had, a sort of model of faith that allowed them to trust God with their lives and deaths, no matter what shape that death took. And some of their deaths were very, brutal and bad deaths, we might say, but also in the context of faith, which was sort of an answered question. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how I'd answer it. There's probably some other aspects to it that, I think, I mean, in some ways, maybe it's the same sort of question I'll lob back to you, which is, I'm sure you get this kind of question, which is, um, aren't we always mitigating risk? Aren't we always sort of thinking about the impacts of our decisions? And isn't that something that has been happening even into sort of ancient ethics? Is there, what's new about the sort of way we view risk today?
Yeah. No, I mean, if you go back to ancient ethics, I think that, I mean, the interesting thing is that the whole idea of risk as like something that's calculable is pretty new. Like,
Yeah.
you didn't even have that word before like the 14th century Italians. And probability theory starts with Pascal in the 17th century. Right. So that's new. And I think in medicine, thinking about health in terms of risk is radically different. Like you look at some of, especially existential kind of phenomenological discussions of health. If you look, for people who are raised before this risk era, so Gadamer or
Mhm.
Canguilhem or people like that, they talk about health as being this absence of concern with your health, right?
Yeah.
Which I talk about. And so medicine was focused on curing people who had serious diseases. That was the focus, right? But it transforms in a certain way that medicine transforms into looking at risk. So I think you see a fundamental shift in the practice, which we can date to certain periods.
Mhm.
So I think in medicine, it's you see it really quite directly. Now, more broadly, I think you see a change in practical reason. Like if you look at how Aristotle describes making a decision, he is always focused on the end, right? And Aquinas similarly, and in more recent people, it's all about the end. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of like, caution. You look to kind of dangers, but you were trying to figure out how to achieve an end. Whereas now I think we're doing much more of something where, well, let's look at the risks and benefits. There's cost benefit analysis is how a lot of people live their life. Look at the risks and benefits of different courses of actions and then try to kind of maximize the good outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, is this ultimately because we have no like shared agreement about what a human being is, or, that there's sort of cost benefit analysis can be easily sort of translated into economic terms, which we do all understand, or, how do you think about why it is that that happens?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think the shift in I mean, I think almost the shift towards cost benefit is driving the kind of underlying like undermining of values and focuses on end in certain ways. But I think that it is also tied to the fact that, well, this is, we might not all agree with what a just society is, but we can all agree that we want to maximize health, right? It makes it easy to kind of have these um, kind of common conversations,
Hmm.
right, across
Yeah.
different people,
Yeah.
which is
Great.
great. Yeah.
Another question about your book, Paul, if you don't mind. I was, I thought you did this admirably in questioning the implementations of certain technologies. You mentioned AI earlier. That's the one that's particularly interesting to me. Obviously, many of us are, particularly interested in that and its, recent developments. And the part that I thought was most interesting was your linking of the use of AI in medicine with de-skilling of physicians. And I think that connects up with the sort of prudential reasoning you're talking about. I'm wondering if that's a broader problem for us as sort of a humanity, AI and de-skilling. I'd love to hear you just sort of like expand on whether you think de-skilling might be a problem beyond medicine. And if so, how do we go about talking about this without coming across as like regressive or anti-technology or sort of closed-minded, given sort of the direction AI seems to be going. I'm just curious how you're wrestling with those kinds of questions.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my work right now is about AI ethics and like this virtue, the virtue of the skill, the loss of skills is a major point. I mean, Shannon Valor has talked about this a
Yep.
lot with kind of the loss of skills of even caregiving and things like that. I mean, I think if you see our students in universities, there's many who are starting to lose the ability to write papers because they can get ChatGPT to write the papers, right? And I think that's a major problem. And I think, how do we respond? I think we have to respond by going back and saying, both recovering virtue ethics, which I really like, but also the good of engaging in these practices of excellence and what those mean for a flourishing life, right? How these practices kind of shape us and lead to good things. And there's lots of people who are doing this, like, Matthew Crawford and Kraft, right? Saying like, you don't have to get rid of everything and go back and live out in the woods, but you should be involved in some kind of craft in your hands because that's going to make you much happier over the long term. I think we see a lot of burnout about amongst doctors, and I think in part it's because of they're just becoming functionaries in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
And so saying like, is it going to be happier? We're going to have a better society if we use AI where it's appropriate and figure out those, but in a way that doesn't diskill us in that way.
Mhm.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, you deal with this focus on practice, and I was yeah, I mean, I think you have this beautiful recovery of practices as a way to kind of turn back to the kind of wrestling with this reflexivity. I mean,
Mhm.
both embedding yourself in traditions, which I want to also talk about, but also like, just engaging in practice of prayer and and the
Mhm.
Eucharist, well, and communion and various kinds of things as ways to kind of recover that for
Mhm.
yourself. I mean, I thought that was beautiful. One of the things that you see who people are also doing that. So you get these recoveries of the Ars Moriendi traditions, right? Which you mentioned, right? And some of those are like you're saying, like going towards some of those, but a lot of them are also focused on what do you do at the bedside itself, and what do we need to do at the bedside. Um, I mean, my question is, yes, those practices prepare you spiritually, but do you think people also need to have kind of a repertoire or a ritual to kind of hit at the actual kind of when they get into the hospital? Do we need to
Yeah.
provide them with
Yeah.
more practices?
Yeah, no, I do think that would be helpful. And I think it would have to come from, you know, within the particular religious traditions and expressions that are there. And I think one of the challenges here is that um, the most formative practices, I think, were developed um, not because we had existential, wrestlings at the end of life at the bedside. They grew more naturally out of expressions of the sort of the basic core convictions of the faith and the role of certain sort of religious authorities or the family or these sorts of things is more organic.
Hmm.
I always struggle with the Ars Moriendi reclamation because it feels arbitrary. And then any new tradition you have that's arbitrary, you always have in the back of your mind the fact that it's recently developed or it's sort of like from you. This is
Hmm.
something that I think, so it's how do you get to the point where those new, liturgies or rituals or traditions actually have the ability to function um, in a sort of strong way to move those sort of questions about what you do from the foreground to the background. In the meantime, it's like, well, we've got this new thing, you might try it. And then you're back in this sort of, choice
Right.
kind of moment, unless it's, developed from on high. So that's why, I really do sort of naturally go back to those practices that are already there, that are widespread within at least my own religious tradition, which is Christianity, and that have that sort of ability to form and shape our uh, they have the ability to transmit deep convictions in an embodied way, whether or not we are aware of it or not, I think in certain ways. But yeah, I think, I would be curious to know what you think about that question, Paul, and whether you have seen any that seem promising or any
Mhm.
roots for ritualization of something. I mean, obviously, in the Catholic Church, there are rituals at the end of life, and that's one of the great, benefits of, it's one of the thicker Christian traditions that has been able to maintain some of those traditions of practice. So if there's ones that you find particularly meaningful for wrestling with agency at the end of life, yeah, I'd be curious to hear you expand upon that.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, in terms of, I mean, a lot of it is going towards that kind of right, learning to let go that you get into, which I want to
Yeah.
get back to in a
Hmm.
moment. But yeah, it's and so there it's really easy in the Catholic tradition to go back to something old and say, look, no, it's still here. It's still here. We just, we can pull out Alphonsus Liguori's like preparation for death and say, yeah, no, it still applies. A lot of people, there's a lot of cases in history where people have done that. But I think, what you're pointing at is important, that having it be part of a broader tradition and making sure you're not just adding it in. And then there were Protestant authors doing the Ars Moriendi stuff as well throughout it,
Hmm.
is really important. I mean, I think we're getting to be at a place where so many people are joining religious traditions not from birth, right? There's so much disaffiliation, but a lot of the people who are coming in are either they were raised kind of vaguely in some religious tradition, and now they're fully embracing it themselves and exploring it themselves, or they're just converting, so they're making this reflexive choice themselves. So, I mean, I think that raises an interesting issue for, like, when you're accepting a practice, engaging a practice like that. Does that shift the kind of arbitrariness in slightly different way?
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things, like drawing from the Catholic tradition, the practices that you mentioned, I mean, clearly Bart, I see, is a huge influence on how you're thinking about. And I thank you, because your discussion of Bart on death was one of the most helpful kind of drawing through that. That was amazing. And Howard Rossi also is kind of very lying in the background to a lot of what you're saying. But for me, I mean, I was just shocked that Richard McCormick is coming back, making this comeback as like a helpful resource. I mean, we haven't heard from him very much, and you make a great use of him and by Ronner. But of course, both of these are Jesuits, and since we're recording this just a couple of days after Pope Francis
Right.
died, like you
Hmm.
talk about the role of Ignatian spirituality, right, in that last chapter, but not so much in the McCormick Ronner
Right.
chapter.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the role of those kinds of practices of prayer that get taken up in shaping how they view death?
Oh, well, I mean, that's something I'm not even sure I'm qualified to answer that. I mean, I do think that that's a connection I hadn't really drawn. I mean, I know clearly that they're both Jesuits, but connecting that to the particular ways that they incorporate theology into their ethical reflection, I think, and um, the way that they are able to sort of, yeah, imaginally make connections between sort of theological doctrines and particular practices, but also go beyond the sort of manualist tradition, in creative and new ways. But one of the things, I think McCormick himself, I have a small discussion in there about he's one of the people who actually wrestles explicitly with the relationship between theology and bioethics, and was very struck by his own discussion about how, in many cases, theology does not provide sort of direct answers to ethical questions, but functions more at the level of sort of either disposition or imagination, and how it sort of forms us in such a way that we see the world in what's sort of like morally relevant features. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He was very cagey about making explicit, exceptionless moral rules for certain practices. But I think I noted everything in his theology points in the direction of, putting him in line with the rest of the, Catholic Church and tradition in many ways on those issues. And that he had sort of more like pragmatic, practical reasons for holding back. But yeah, it's really fascinating connection. I really like that. I want to think more about it. Can I shift the conversation back to
Yeah,
your own
sure.
work, Paul? And this maybe is helpful, a way to sort of connect back even into mine and the Ars Moriendi. I think this is relevant, but um, you talk about virtues as sort of a central way forward,
Hmm.
and clearly, virtues are formed through practice and in moral communities, and you give some great examples of some virtuous moral communities in medicine at the end of the book, which I really appreciated. And I guess I was just curious to hear you talk about what are the avenues for virtue formation for people who want to be in medicine or maybe even genetics and precision medicine or touch on the world that you're talking about, given all the institutional and cultural pressures that they're going to face. Where do these virtues come from? Are they in some sense sort of medical virtues? I mean, you mentioned prudence, practical wisdom, and solidarity specifically. Curious is just to learn how you're thinking about the sort of the process of virtuous formation for people in medicine. What does that look like, you think?
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean that's a great question. I mean, it goes back to some of my earliest work, kind of in
Right.
science and Christian ethics, where I love Aristotle, but I'm coming more out of the Stoic tradition of ethics. And Stoics always thought you were going to be in a bad place when you started trying to get virtuous. Like they thought, the world is corrupt, you're probably corrupt, so you really got to work yourself into being virtuous, right? So they have the whole tradition of practice that you have to develop on your own to kind of form the virtues. So it's a lot of work on the self, these kinds of things. So I mean, I think that's one thing is that this is also something that people do have to struggle with in kind of science and medicine and kind of taking on themselves, like finding their avenues of formation. But that doesn't mean that there aren't larger kind of ways we can reshape training in these
Mhm.
areas. Right. So I mean, this is what a lot of religious ethics scholars are trying to do is try to form undergrads really well, try to form people in the churches, give them the tools to start thinking about their lives in these kinds of virtue methodologies. Right. I
Mhm.
mean, this is why we're writing these books, is trying to help people take, oh, you're already kind of have an acceptance of these. Now just apply them to your life or to your to your job, to how you're approaching death, these kinds of things. And I think in in medicine itself, one of the things that I touch on the book and I'm continuing to reflect on a lot is, well, how do we actually design the shape of medicine in the hospital in a way which doesn't de-skill, right? How do we design these new technologies we're putting in place in the clinic so that they're actually helpful tools rather than you have a chatbot that's acting as the doctor, right? Or that's replaced, kind of the doctor is forced to just follow what the AI says or the risk calculation says. So I think there's a way that we can design our tools so that they can better support, people acting virtuously. And I mean, there are a lot of groups of doctors right now who are trying to recover with this kind of virtue tradition in medicine. So a lot of kind of societies coming together to try to support people and trying to do this kind of reform. So, I mean, I think there's no simple answer, right? A lot of
Mhm.
times, you teach students as well. So a lot of times they're like, what's the ethical answer that's going to like form us? And it's like, well, there's not one, right? There's a network of practices, there's things that need to change, but uh,
Well, just to me, I hear what you're saying and I wholeheartedly agree. And um, it always feels like a rear guard action, and it always feels like you're sort of reclaiming like what little bit you can. And I think a lot of it applies similarly to the stuff I've written. Um, which brings in another virtue, which maybe we could talk about. Is like, how do you maintain hope that, it could be different in the future, or that it isn't sort of necessarily only going in one direction, but that you can carve out spaces for this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean that is the tough thing. I mean that's beautiful thing about Christianity is that it's this as you keep saying, in your book, right? It's not up to you, right? You're
Hmm.
ultimately not in charge of this. Ultimately, we have to give everything up. I mean, you can do what you can, but you have to kind of trust that God is going to eventually do something good in the
Hmm.
end, and that's what hope is. It's not optimism, right? It's not yeah, cheeriness, but
Hmm.
it's that kind of conviction about God. One question I had about you that I would love your kind of thoughts on and how to deal actually like how you relate your answers in with things like your kind of responses and practices in with hospice and palliative care. So
Hmm.
I love your critique of physician assisted suicide in the book. I mean, like you're drawing on how it's so clear how it kind of ties into your enforced burden agency and it forces this choice which can demean the vulnerable, right? So
Hmm.
it's all tied into the autonomous self, right? So you have a nice kind of development of that. Um, but you also say so a lot of times in Catholic circles, Catholic healthcare, and a lot of Christian healthcare, you have the option. Well, we have hospice, right? That is going to be the answer. You don't think it's going to be the answer. I mean, you're less critical of it than of
Hmm.
physician assisted suicide, but you also think it's not going to be sufficient. I'd love to, kind of expand on your reasons for why that's the case. And do you think some kind of reformed hospice that takes kind of advantage of your insights
Hmm.
could be a way forward?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's among medical options at the end of life, it's the one that more typically will align with um, the moral disposition or stance that I'm sort of putting forward, which is like I think the term I use is like submissive receptivity, before the Lord of what God has, whether it's more days or fewer days, but you sort of that doesn't have to be totally passive. It doesn't have to mean no medicine, no choices, but it also sort of like puts you out of the center in a sense. And I do think hospice and palliative care are, far more often more humane options at the end of life. Humane in that sense of sort of like not working against our humanity as sort of a over medicalized death often does. And I think also as assisted suicide and euthanasia often does as well, sort of working against the proper shape of humanity. So it's definitely better. I think the thing I want to recognize about it is that it often, in a pluralistic society like ours, where our problem, at least part of it, has to do with this hyper-reflexivity and not having a sense of sort of meaning and purpose at the end of life, or at least meaning and purpose into which the end of our life can fit, is that at least, especially early on, and I think maybe even today, hospice and palliative care can basically become like individualized versions of meaning making. They sort of invite us into a process of making a narrative for our life that this sort of death can become a fitting conclusion. Well, that's all well and good, but it's also very individualistic. And I think my skepticism is whether those can really take in a deep way, or whether they might add similar sorts of anxieties about what our stories amount to, and placing ourselves in the middle in that way and not fitting our sort of small story into a bigger story that makes sense of everything. And so, really, it is that's part of it. I think the other part is that it is focused on extending the um, a particular form of selfhood and agency as long as possible, which that form of selfhood and agency is not bad per se, but it's one that I think is not all inclusive of our you know options as humanity. I think this sort of um, self as author, self as in control, can sort of also play into hospice narratives as well. And so, and then also there's just the practical issues of, you can put someone on hospice and then somebody who's taking care of them, freaks out and calls the ambulance, and now you're stuck in the, um, ICU, and that sort of thing happens more often than we like to say. So, yeah, those are a couple of things, but I think, I mean, I would love to see Christians be more involved in hospice and palliative care. I love hearing stories about people who have a call to ministry or various sorts of gifts, and then they decide that where they want to employ them is walking alongside people at the end of life. And when that can happen in a way that more organically connects your story to the gospel itself, I think it's actually a very fitting way to enact that form of like trusting agency before the Lord that doesn't assume that you have to be in control all the way up into the end. And I actually think, the critiques of it often, especially from the assisted suicide crowd, is that they're just not enough options for pain control or these sorts of things. And I think my understanding, at least, is that that's largely not the case, that we actually are, by and large, have most of what we need to help keep people comfortable, at least until the end of their natural lives. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely much better.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's right. Yeah, no, I mean, I thought your take on it and your criticisms of it were kind of very much
Yeah.
on target as to both like how it could be wonderful, like if you get back to the original stories, but also the kind of, yeah, I mean, you'll read stories of people talking about it and be like, well, we just help people discover what their death, their valued death is. And then you end up with people who are like wanting to play video games quite a bit, and saying
Mhm.
like that's, kind of what they've discovered. And it's like, I'm not sure I would trumpet that as the
Yeah.
success, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Great. Paul, I've kind of like probably sort of like coming toward the end, I think, of our conversation, but like a broader question, for you and how you approach your work, that I'd just love to hear you talk about as somebody who obviously has a background in science, who writes ethics books primarily, but you're also a professor of theology. And so, I'm always wrestling with these kinds of questions myself, but would love to hear you talk a little bit about, theology doesn't really come up, at
Mhm.
least directly in the book. So what role does it play for you? Where's the sort of, connection point? And if you had to make theology more explicit in your sort of engagement with these kinds of questions, where would you go? What kinds of things would you talk about?
Yeah, for me, when I think about how much theology to pack into it, like if you read the footnotes, the theology is there, right?
Yeah.
So, but and I also in my some of my previous work, I work through the theology of risk and around risk of it, kind of in more depth. But this one was written for the medical community, and I'd hope, for a lot of Christian doctors, but also for the broader medical community, right?
Yeah.
Saying like this is what you can do. So I mean, so part of the reason why you had that play, kind of downplayed was to just make it more acceptable, like accessible to like not acceptable, accessible to others who don't have that background. But if you look at my other work, where I put in the kind of focus is on providence, right?
Hmm.
Except it's very similar to what you're calling for in your book.
Hmm.
It's surrendering one's kind of actions to God, trying to discern God's will for your life, right? And following through on that. That's what we're called to do, even if that might lead us into risk, even if that leads us into suffering, right?
Yeah.
Um, God frequently calls us to failure, right? To actions that lead to failure. So that is where the primacy is, but also a very Bardian notion of responsibility, right? Trying to respond to God's call in the moment. And with a trust that God is caring for us, caring for the shape of history.
Mhm.
And that is, kind of how that we can rely on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but also charity enters in the kind of social care that we should have for each other as fellow creatures made in the image of God, right?
Mhm.
Other themes that I touch on.
That's great. Love that.
Yeah. So I guess one of my question, I guess again, similarly drawing to a close is um, are you building this into further projects or are you going into a different direction?
Yeah, that's great. I am sort of starting to move into a different direction, probably in many ways in line with your own work, Paul. I would love to have ongoing conversations about this. The big idea I'm wrestling with now is what I'm calling moral friction,
Nice.
uh, meaning there's a sense in which if you're going to have conversations about AI and GPT, for example, in education or in healthcare, maybe questions about biomedical moral enhancement or like why we shouldn't just use, medical means to make ourselves better people.
Yeah.
You quickly get into this position of having to defend difficulty itself
Hmm.
as constitutive part of the good life, and not just sort of the end that you can get to, but it's sort of like a process
Yeah.
kind of view, and the role of difficulty and pushback and struggle in a sense. So like friction is kind of the best word I have for that
Hmm.
um, right now, and it's not suffering per se, but it's somehow connected to suffering, but it's something different, and so really the next project's going to be a longer treatment of the role of sort of why it's good that the world pushes back, and what is the role of friction, and there's I'm trying to do something multidisciplinary and something that, will take some time to get up to speed on. But, how does that play out in ancient philosophical ethics, for example, but also in, uh, you know, um, uh, evolutionary biology, right? What's the role of friction in evolutionary biology? What about neurobiology and cognitive
Hmm.
science? What about some of these other sort of philosophical approaches to attention, in craft?
Yeah.
Matthew Crawford's work clearly is relevant here, and others. And then what are the theological kind of like avenues we might take it? So I've got some similar questions about like what are the doctrines where this comes up the most in terms of incarnation, creation, um, our calling and vocation, and some of those things. So it's related. It's kind of about like agency in the
Right.
world, right? A sort of how do we understand that? But it's a little bit, it's not quite as focused on end of life and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's drawing all those themes of suffering and kind of how do we
Mhm.
deal with the difficulties facing us. Yeah, well, yeah, the Stoics would love that project. Like that
Yeah.
seems very
Okay.
much in line with that.
Well, then now you have to answer your own question, Paul. I'd love to hear where you're headed.
Yeah, so mine is more of an, kind of extension, but in new areas from this. So a lot of precision medicine is driven by AI, right? And so that and other things in the time has given me focus on kind of, well, the many ways that AI is being used in medicine. So I think we don't have a very good fundamental theology of technology yet. I mean, we do have a lot of like tools, and there's a lot of people who've drawn little bits that kind of I totally rely on. But I think there is more development that needs to be done in theology of technology, especially in an age of AI. Right. So that is kind of what I want to do right now. But there's also a lot of little kind of more practical, pragmatic projects around AI and in medicine that I'm working on at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, cool. Well, thank you both so much again for this very interesting conversation. We've been talking about Burden Agency, Christian Theology, and End-of-Life Ethics by Travis Pickell, and The Ethics of Precision Medicine, Problems of Prevention in Healthcare by Paul Scherz. Thank you both so much again, and thank you for watching.